Welcome to Together, a higher ed podcast where we bring you stories, insights, and experiences from voices across the higher education sector. I'm Chase Haygood, the Vice Provost for Student Success at the University of Utah. Today, we're joined by a good friend, an innovator, a colleague, Malika Clinkscales, the Vice President for Faculty Mentor Strategy at Western Governors University, leading the strategic direction for the university's 2,000 mentors supporting 180,000 strong. Formerly, she served as the Senior Associate Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at Inside Track, where she worked for 11 years providing strategic support to client partners in enrollment and student success. Malika has held various positions, from coach to program director, strategic partnership director, and more. A passionate advocate for coaching, she believes every dream is worth pursuing. Welcome, Malika.
Thank you, Chase.
I'm so excited. On the drive-in this morning, I was like, Malika is going to be here today. I told Marshall, my kiddo, I was like, Marshall, Malika is coming to Daddy's work today, and we're going to chat, and we're going to talk about higher education. And he was like, okay. And then he's off to something else. Yeah. But he acknowledged it.
Did he?
Yeah.
I love it.
You know our kiddo. You certainly know Lori. Like his willingness to be like, oh, okay, that's good for you, Dad.
Yeah, I'm happy for you.
I was like, okay, I'm in a little bit more excitement. I'm excited, but he was there. I am delighted. Again, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's
for
exciting,
being willing.
Surreal, and just full circle to be here today.
I love it. Well, on that same commute, and as we talked about before we started recording, the drive-in, I think we've known each other coming up on a decade.
Yep, a decade.
And I so deeply admire your commitment and your work, like the good work that you have done and that you have led, and now that you're bringing to Western Governors. I am really excited just to sit down, and every opportunity that I get to sit down and chat with you about the pressing issues. I'm just so delighted that you're here.
Well, I'm just honored to be here, and to have you as a thought partner and friend and colleague for this many years is just, it's unimaginable. And just to have your brilliance and your passion, your humanity, and in the way that you see the world, it makes me a better leader.
Well, you're really kind. I appreciate that. Let's talk a little bit about career journey.
Sure.
Let's talk about, along the way.
Yeah.
From, I don't know, Malika at, let's say 20 or 21, if you look back retrospectively and you say, okay, these are the choices I made. Can you talk a little bit about the passions or the commitments or the interests that kind of fueled your journey, your career up to this point? Because I know a little bit about that journey, having come to know you, but I know that our listeners, viewers would love to hear part of that story as much as you're willing to tell.
Absolutely, and thank you for that prompt. This will be an interesting combination. I think there are two points that I really want to lean into. One is, at my core, I was really raised in higher education. So I'm the daughter of a retired professor, but early on, we're talking as she finished her doctorate, I was in her classes as a 6-week-old, preschool. We're at university campuses. So there's a part of me that's always been connected to higher education and really had at an early beginning an understanding of what it means to get a college degree. So much so that it was just normative for me, right? With that, I think the sense of belonging for me was planted back then, because my mother's friends were professors, and I thought everyone had a doctorate. Not because that was real life, but that was my real life, right? And so what was really planted in me was this understanding of education and going to pursue your dreams, right? I think in my 20s, coming out of Howard University, my goal then was to be a physician. And I had a real passion for the human body, for educating individuals about their health, really imagined a career that would allow me to do gender-based medicine and help provide a holistic understanding of the health of women. And somewhere along the way, really my third year of medical school, ran into some challenges with my licensure exams. Through a very long story that will take more than your podcast, but the highlights are, I can give you the cliff notes.
Okay.
That resulted in me not being able to complete my degree. And I think there entered another key point for my career around completion and student success, right? And so when a medical student has to pivot from a track of pretty much 20 years of prerequisites and moving forward to imagining something different, there's really not a support system or a plan or a coach or a strategy. And so I think as I entered into this phase of my career, which ultimately was really connected to helping people make connections to where they want to be. And I believe that seed was planted when I was a young child. It became important for me to figure out, how do you provide people with the missing element for them to get to their next best place in life. And for me, that was very clearly rooted in the space of coaching, having that conversation where people can be vulnerable, that place where people can really imagine without judgment, to then get some type of accountability and like, let's go for it plan, right? That was very attractive to me in a season where I felt like I didn't even know where to start in terms of having a new dream. So I really think, in a really unexpected way in the universe, what I needed most is what I became.
Well, I just want to pause. I mean, that is powerful. When we think about, and I've seen it play out, Malika, I've seen your leadership up close. I think your willingness to take your own experience, which at a critical kind of moment, I mean, those of us that are familiar, I didn't go through med school, but I've mentored and coached a lot of students that are on that track. I mean, that is not it's kind of like the graduate degree in the humanities to an extent, where it's kind of like, that is a long haul commitment. Yes. That is not something that,
Correct.
From the intro biology course.
Freshman year.
Or OChem.
Yeah. Yep.
All the way through.
Yeah.
I think that is not a small thing.
Yeah.
And I think your willingness in your leadership philosophy to leverage what was a critical moment in your own life, in your own career, to think about being and designing and engaging conversations in so many, I mean, Malika, your work has touched thousands upon thousands of students. I mean, it just has.
It's mind-blowing, yeah.
Like your leadership of teams to engage in that moment in all those individual lives, that, it's like trying to anticipate what could be a critical juncture.
Right.
And because you've been there and your willingness to acknowledge it and talk openly about it and talk about how do we design ahead of time to sort out and empower students to make their own informed decisions.
Right.
And that if one path seems stalled, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but know that there are other paths.
There are other paths, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about, in that respect, how you keep that interest kind of alive?
Yeah.
I mean, because that, even, as I think about it, and I've watched your work and engaged with you as partner in work at a couple of places now, I can imagine a scenario where that interest could begin to dim or fade.
Right.
Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah. I'm wrong about a lot of things. But could
I
you,
doubt that.
Could you talk a little bit about, like, what fills up that energy for you?
I think one of the things that I do is I want to keep in mind an individual's journey, put it that way. So when I think about higher education and I think about student success, I think about a person, even though we're talking about thousands of students, I always go back to an individual person. And I think about that student that wants to go to college, or that student that doesn't have a support system, or that student that doesn't know what they want to do with their career. I always think about the masses, but the masses by thinking about an individual kind of at a crossroads and really trying to figure out, what do I do with my life, right? And one of the ways that I remember that concretely every day, and people will not know this, they might see it, but they might not know it, on my desk is my graduation picture from my undergraduate degree. One of the proudest days of my life, right? I really wanted to go to Howard. My mother taught at Howard, and so growing up, she was like, you don't really want to go there. You just want to go there as a teacher there. I was like, no, really. And so seeing that picture of me beaming in my blue cap and gown reminds me of the joy I felt that day. It reminds me of the Kim that kicked my butt.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of my own journey and how that journey was not just for me. And so it allows me to dig deep and think about, what are the interventions, what are the programs, what are the patterns, what are the partnerships that are necessary so that more people can have that experience. And that doesn't get old.
Yeah. So as I'm listening, and every time I chat with you, Malika, I'm grateful for our friendship, because every time I chat with you, I see the world, and I think about the challenges and the opportunities that in our work, kind of in the sector, that we're able to and privileged to be a part of leading through and, into and all that. And the issue of scale always comes up. And I'll say it here. I think that the way that you just described a very precise kind of balance, that when we move to like, it's got to be a scalable solution, I think we can all acknowledge whatever the intervention is, like, how quickly can we get to scale? It's like, right, yes, that is one of the questions. But the scale to one is where, and balancing that, the scale to one is what I think motivates so many of us, because it's at the one that you see the life transformation and potential, and where you see the investment. And again, it is balance.
It is balance.
But that energy kind of, and the drive to ensure that we don't lose sight of the one student.
Right.
And then the aggregate of all of those ones get us to scale.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, you want to see that one is replicable.
Yep.
Right. So you want to think about, what does this look like at scale? Because that's where you ultimately have to get to for the ultimate impact. But you also have to drill down back to that individual one experience to make sure that you're being authentic to that individual.
Yep.
And if you're doing that, if that recipe or rubric is working on an individual level, then it's okay now times the thousands.
Yep. Yeah. Awesome. So are there other things over the course of your career that have really, if you look back and you think, okay, that was a pivotal moment. That was a moment that shaped who I am and how I see the work. And maybe we talk a lot about at the U about how we want the exceptional educational experience to help students see themselves, the world, and themselves in the world in new ways. Like,
I think if I go back to that experience, I think there was one statement that stood out for me when I was at that crossroads. And a lot of people were trying to help me make the shift that I needed to make. But it's kind of like what we were just talking about with that scale to one and one to scale. One of the student success, very well-meaning support staff said to me, this isn't the first, you weren't the first person this has happened to. And I think it was meant to make me not feel alone. But that's not how it landed. It landed as if you need to get over this because other people you're not. And because my response was, but it's the first time it's happened to me.
Yep.
Right? And so I think if you can remember the humanity in people and not serve so many students that you don't remember what did it feel like to be at point A or point B. It took me really being entrenched in the student success work to understand how much higher education privilege I had, right? I mean, I grew up listening to my mother talk about defenses and doctoral dissertations. And I grew up saying, Mom, so-and-so's on the phone, as I'm sure Marshall will at one day, right? And I didn't know that I didn't know. And so once I was in this work, I was like, how many dots were connected for you? How much did your mom navigate higher education for you? Because that was her business. That was her craft, her trade, right? I was a transfer student in undergrad, but my mom said, okay, we're going to go to the school you're going to, which is ultimately Howard University, and we're going to look at what courses you need next semester, and we're going to make sure the courses you take this semester, will fully transfer next semester, so you don't lose. That was an advisor, right? Yep. But that was a kitchen table conversation.
Yep.
And so I am. It's very much a privilege to have had that level of support, but it should not be exclusive either, right? And so when I listen to people say that they didn't have that lamp, they didn't have that type of roadmap, they didn't have that navigator, my life would be so different, right? If I hadn't had that. And so I think it's incumbent upon me and others to work hard to provide that for others. So I guess it's kind of it's a mixture of what was a gap for me and what was abundant for me that I think really informed my thoughts and my desires and my philosophies around student success.
It's just a really powerful, I think, as I hear you describe it, a powerful kind of like awareness and consciousness around, we all come to higher education from different places and across a kind of continuum. Right. And so thinking about and being aware of the kinds of kitchen table conversations that some folks are I think a lot about our next year's incoming first year class, right? First time full time for the next year. I'm constantly thinking about and seeing data sheets for our current students as well and all that. But thinking about the kitchen table conversations, I like to think about it as what's going to happen at Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Where those conversations for many of our students get real. Like what apps are going in, where are we going to do those college tours? It may be the second for some to confirm or affirm a choice. And then across that, or wide across that continuum, are the students who are not necessarily, they don't have a support system in place. That conversation isn't just naturally happening.
Correct.
It's not surrounding them organically. No. I think a lot about those students, and they may not, even as a first-gen graduate myself, they may not have had the privilege of the parents that I had, who, though they had not been to college, just simply said, we don't know what it is, but you're going.
But you're going, exactly.
And you're going to have to figure some of this out on your own.
But that's your path.
But it is happening.
Correct. That was my grandmother who finished her education or went into cosmetology school at 16, but she read bedtime stories to my mother about academic hoodings. So at 5, so my mom has a PhD, right? Yeah. Right, but that was her bedtime stories were about hoodings and commencements, and so she kind of put this fire in my mom she didn't have it. My grandfather did 1 year of college, but that's what transpired in my mom's life. So it was that same, but that exposure, or at least holding up a light of belief for someone, and then hoping that, the support system would be there to carry it through.
Yeah. Ooh, I got a lot of thoughts. I want to keep us on track.
Sure.
I'll just simply say, I think what you just described and so many collection of all of our individual stories, the scale back out becomes what's concerning, I think, around the real danger then of the devaluation, particularly of public higher education then, or higher education writ large, is it's nested in that, in both of our stories and the stories that are replicated across thousands, hundreds of thousands of people whose lives, and then the next generation of their families' lives. And then you kind of keep extending like ripples across, a lake. denying that or saying or creating doubt in that space, I just don't think it serves us well as a society.
Right. I agree.
In a multitude of different ways, which maybe that's another podcast. So
you don't get in trouble.
That's
stay
right.
On the course.
That's right. We'll stay on course. I'll be good. What are the outcomes? Let's talk about impacts, challenges, opportunities.
Sure.
Outcomes that you can think of, that you're aware of, that you're leading out on, that you're envisioning for the new work, not just for you especially, I'm interested in that, and in your official capacity now with WGU, and the way that perhaps those outcomes lead us to where, I should preface the question by saying, my sense right now is that we've got an ongoing debate, not just about the public value, but about how we define student success.
Right.
And that definition is it can be really broad, it could be kind of narrow, but I'm wondering where you are on that in terms of the outcomes of the work and how that helps frame what you're pursuing, what, the programs, the initiatives, et cetera, and how does that interact with an overall definition, let's say, of student success?
Yeah, so I think for me personally, having been in this work, for over a decade, one of the things that always rubbed me wrong was often crafting student success and coaching interventions for a select group, right? It was the notion that who needs it the most? And while that is honorable to identify a gap for a particular group, I argue that being a student is the one job everybody's had and nobody prepared them for, right? And so if you think about it from that lens of what makes you really an effective student, right? You kind of get your backpack and your lunchbox and you go to school and you just figure it out, right? And then as you advance, you might get, a tutor or this or that, and depending upon what resources your family has, to really delve into, what makes me an effective learner. Am I auditory? Am I visual? Right? Those types of things. So coaching or student success coaching, advising, mentoring, it is often touted as an exclusive intervention for a particular group that might be most needing. And I think what I am really drawn to is why can't everybody have that support, right? And we know that in, the athletic world, the best of the best coaches, right, have a coach. Athletes have a coach, whether that's LeBron James, Serena Williams before she retired, any athlete. And it's about getting to your ultimate best place, right? So what I have lamented while over the years I've been responsible for all these interventions, it was always somewhat disappointing at times to say 500, 1,000, 200. And I would always think in my head, what about the rest of them? What about the student that may not be first gen, or they're just, they're not fitting the particular, and it's all guided by funding and resources of the institution. So it's not, I understand, the limitations. But it doesn't mean if you didn't fit in a certain bucket, you didn't necessarily have access to that. And everybody deserves that space to have somebody believe in their dream or believe in what they're trying to create. It might not even be a dream. It's just okay, I'm here. So how do I figure this out? So defining student success for me means everyone that starts on this path deserves to complete it. No one goes to any school, technical college, community college, four-year public, private. No one starts it. They may not even kind of see the full journey, but there's a inkling of a belief that they can do it, right?
Yeah.
Student success is seeing everybody cross the line. It's seeing everybody get to the starting line and being able in some way through multiple interventions, guide, support, wave, direct, celebrate them getting to the finish line. So I think that was an underpinning that always kind of bothered me, over the years. At this point in my career, being at Western Governors, that's a part of the design model, is that every student is assigned a mentor upon enrollment. That was fascinating to me, that was like out the gate. Everybody and that person or team stays with you until you complete. And to see that at scale across an entire university, that level of support is fascinating. So now, and it doesn't mean that's because the model is there, that it's not, that there aren't challenges.
Sure.
And so now the challenges become like, so what are the strategies? What are the support system? How do you leverage technology? How do you make sure that mentors and coaches have the resources that they need? How do you prepare them for certain types of conversations? Like, I think there's a bucket list of things that then need to. So the answer isn't just the model, right?
Yep.
It's then what do you put into the model to make sure that those learners are actually, then not just the learners, but that the people supporting the learners, that they have what they need. And that to me is what keeps me up at night. Like that to me is not just having the audacious goal, but how prepared is your staff to deliver on that goal? And if you haven't done the work of doing that, do you have a right to have that goal? Right? If you haven't leveraged the resources and the conversations and the strategy and all the things, the stakeholder relationships to request whatever is needed, I think it's kind of abdicating responsibility to have the goal without doing the in the trench workers from an administrative level to drive those outcomes.
I love that in several ways.
Okay.
Because if I can, I think what I hear you saying, and I'd love you to kind of unpack a little bit of it, because part of it, what I hear you say is, we as the formal leaders, wherever we sit within the organization, if the staff or the professional experts that are frontline and engaged with the learners, what I hear you describe there, Malika, is valuing those individuals from the perspective of, if we're going to ask of them to do X, Y, and Z, whatever's part of the model, of the design, of the initiative, then there should be this kind of reciprocity of value and of trust.
Yes.
If we're going to have those aspirational goals, we should ensure that not only are they trained, but here at the U, coming soon, will be more of a, how do we tap into the joy and the celebration of milestones that mark success right along the way. But if we don't have that, really what I hear you describe is a really clear set of expectations, but expectations that come with value.
Correct.
Like, I value the work that you're doing. Could you say more about that?
Yeah.
I mean, do I hear you right?
You did. You did. I think it's easy to think about the retention goal. That's the metric, right? That's success.
Yep.
In order to get to retention and to get to completion, then let's say that if we're using coaching as that intervention, then there is, how are we providing that for the learner? Great. But then there is, if you go back just another layer, it is, what does that person need to show up as the best coach, mentor for that student?
Yep.
And I think that's where the administration has to come into play in terms of trust. We trust you to have that frontline relationship. We trust that you're going to have that conversation. We trust and believe and know that you're passionate enough to be there and sit in that space. What are we doing to make sure that you are successful in doing your job, right? And so to me, it's exciting to think about, and I think that's then ensuring that the staff is successful in feeling prepared. No one wants to go to work and feel
Right.
inadequately prepared.
Yep.
Whether that's technology, whether that is training, whether that is financial resources. I mean, there's a whole host of things that goes into the student success professional showing up to that front line, right?
Yep.
And if they are showing up as their best selves with support from those that have those higher level strategic decisions, that trickles to what the student experiences.
Yep.
And so to me, defining student success is, yes, the completion of everyone. And that's an audacious statement. I recognize that. In fact, you can even say like, oh, well, only this percent, a small percent didn't complete, or a small percent dropped. Well, let's talk about that. That small percent, if you go back to that individual statement, they lost their goal, they lost their dream, they lost their career path. How are we okay with that? If we remember the individual, right? If they're just not a percentage bucket. So my point is, how do we think about what coaches, mentors, student success staff need to be effective so that they have the best chance at providing the most enriching coaching environment and experience for our students? And to me, you can't separate those. And if you do, then you're going to have a frustrated staff. You're going to have burnt out workers. And nobody wants that.
Yeah. Part of that too, I'll share, I think, if we're investing in the spaces that you're talking, you're describing them, there is something to resting in knowing that if we believe in evidence and research-based strategies, right? Most of my career has been at research universities. Yeah. So if we tout our research enterprise and what we believe research is able to do for the world, for the state, our local communities, and the like, and the individual.
Right.
Then, as we deploy those, resting comfortably in the fact that if we're investing in those student success professionals to do their work, that the individual students can get to completion. We believe that they can get to completion. And then knowing that the metrics that we reflect out to the rest of the world through performance-based funding or what have you, will take care of themselves.
Absolutely.
If we invest in the hard work or the good work that's worth doing.
Yes.
Locally. And again, it comes back to the balance. We've got to be, and to your point about, each institution is different and how they allocate the resources and all of that. But the frontline kind of investment, do we believe that these research and evidence-based approaches can work? Right. If we believe that, then let's move on it and know that those larger kind of aggregate or cumulative numbers are going to take care of themselves as we go.
Correct.
Powerful, really, really good stuff. I'm wondering, those metrics bring me to like, what challenges do you see when you're doing the work? That ever persistent question of how do we know where we are, when we are, and how we define student success. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about those challenges and then the moments that we know that we see success, and what do we do in those moments?
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is we often think about engagement. How do we get engagement with the learners? Sometimes coaching outreach, mentor outreach doesn't appear to be working. And so I think sometimes there is a frustration of how do we get them on the phone? How do we get them responsive to the emails? So I think there's a couple things there. One, I'm always reminded of days, years, eons ago when I was coaching, and I went from a coach role into a management role, and I sent essentially a goodbye email to let them know, like, you're going to have a new coach, this is, effective this date. And the people that responded to that email were not the ones that I had weekly meetings with, because they knew. Abundantly, it was the group that I'd never talked to. And what they said was, oh my gosh, where are you going? What do you mean? How can you do that? And I was like, I've never talked to you. How do you have this much, indignation and outrage at my transition? But what they said to me is, but I knew you were always there.
Yeah.
So one, I think there's a challenge of looking at those metrics and deciding what they mean from engagement. And it's assessing the abstract. So I'm not saying it's easy. But what I am saying, there is if we could quantify presence, right? Like, And we don't want, these interventions to be, in case of emergency, break glass. But if it is viewed that way and students feel like I'm trucking along and I'm doing well, but I know this coachy person they're in my they're in my village.
Yeah.
They're in my toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
And when it gets rough, I can leverage them. So I think there's an opportunity to kind of rethink what that means, what engagement means.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think administrators spend a lot of time over assessing and maybe discounting where a student is or isn't based upon some of those metrics. I think that's a huge challenge because you want students to pick up, you want to see that you have that engagement and communication pathway, and at some level you're just not going to have it.
Yeah.
And then you still have to believe that the intervention has value. I think another challenge is thinking and pushing the upper limits on how do you make sure your interventions are student friendly in terms of student centered. And I believe that's a big part of WGU's model in terms of thinking about PACE, creating a model that allows students to advance through a competency-based model, whether that's one class a term, whether that's 6 classes. I think another opportunity is thinking about, the timing for these students. A lot of students are wanting to go back, but may not be able to go back to a traditional brick and mortar school. Mm-hmm. And so I think the innovation of having different educational pathways, right? Yep. Of, yes, I can't go back to school, or I can't go to school, or I'm going to have to work at least part-time. What does that mean? And so valuing through the higher education landscapes, the different models, so there is a choose your own adventure. But again, looking at WGU's model of pace, time, and then again, being able to really have, and I'm bringing that up obviously because I work at WGU, and so those are some values that we've created around how a student can matriculate in an asynchronous model and a competency-based model, and at a pace that works for them. Those are some core components. But in every university, every college, you really should be thinking about what does it look like for us that's student-centered. And I think often it's more about the institution and traditional ways of doing things. Mm-hmm. And can you throw it up against the wall and say, where's the individual in this? Mm-hmm. Yes, it has to work at scale, but where's the student in this? And can we refine our approaches in a way that might be uncomfortable for administration and staff, but is more friendly to the needs? So that means different hours that are offered. Does it mean some weekend opportunity? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
How do you, and so I think the challenge is meeting students where they are instead of dragging to where we want them to be.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a huge challenge for us because it is, we can get really entrenched into the way that we have built higher education and the way that it should function. And then students are to kind of be baptized into that and learn and fit in. But what if we actually took the time to figure out, well, how do we meet them where they are, regardless of your model, regardless of 2-year, 4-year? What if we thought about what makes the most sense for the student? And that sounds so simple and yet groundbreaking and radical at the same time.
Yeah, it forces us, I love it because it forces us to either very quickly or in a perhaps strategically phased approach, rethink and redesign in real time. In a way, as I was, that first example that you gave, I think the willingness and the desire to honor the individual student, locating them where they are, takes a kind of awareness that, well, an awareness, an investment, and a willingness to entertain other possibilities, right? Could this be done better?
Right.
And I don't know, I'd love to hear if you, has that been a challenge over the course of your career? Like when you're willing to be at the table, or you're at the table, and you've earned your spot at the table, and you say, Yeah, but is that really working all that well for students? Like the willingness to take the idea and sling it up against the wall and say, where's the student in that?
Right.
Like my sense is, and I'm going to stop and let you respond, because part of it is what I read in a multitude of different institutions is that the willingness to take the idea and investigate it, that there is this negative inertia, a very kind of, no, you don't, wait a second, Chase.
Right.
Like,
what are you doing?
Wait a second. To your last point, that seems the sheer asking of the question or calling the question on this policy, this process, and saying, could we do it better? Could it serve students better?
Yeah.
And in so doing, serve faculty, staff, alums, other stakeholders, supporters.
I find that in my experience, most of the time, it's the students have to fit in. They have to get in where they fit in. And we want to, it's almost the opposite. They are fortunate and blessed to have the opportunity to come into higher education. And this is what they need to learn. And this is how they need to fall in line. And these are the policies that support that. Even if it means that student goes in circles 4 times, even if it means there are 2 signatures, that could be condensed into one, that type of thing. Even if it means, why can't the student get that support? Why can't that be an online form? Why is that an on-campus dean meeting? I think there are a lot of, in higher ed, people are more invested in the structure, the rubric of higher ed, and what that means for tradition, than actually finding how does that land for the student? It's almost like a hazing of sorts. If they can cut it, then they'll make it. But how do we cut it for them so that they can make it?
Right.
I find that is very rare, and the people that usually embrace that type of philosophy don't last long because they seem isolated in their circles, in their institutions.
I'm hoping and praying for more of those folks.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because to your earlier point, if we're going to see all of the students make their way to the finish line, and it may be through multiple tries at a couple of different places until the right fit happens for that individual student.
Right.
Because without it, something you said earlier is it's going to stick with me for a while. I think what you're describing, and I absolutely agree with you, is that when that student doesn't complete, that is the dream deferred to the next generation.
It is. It is.
With all of the data and research that we have about social mobility in this country and nested within higher education, like the driving kind of sector for upward social mobility in this country post-World War II. And if we don't see more students completing, or if we see the devaluation of, call it whatever you want.
Yeah.
Return on investment.
Right.
Whatever label anybody wants to put on it. I mean, that seems to be emerging as the driving issue of our time.
It absolutely is, because that is the connecting point to fueling social mobility and seeing that career advancement. And so when that person has that setback, it's tremendous to think that they'll saddle up again. And they actually don't have a reason to, because higher education has told them now, you don't fit.
Right. Well, and the willingness of folks, I'm just going to say generally, the folks in higher ed.
I'm making sweeping generalizations, so thank
you.
And
I agree.
Okay.
It's like the willingness to take a minute, like take a beat, and say, well, what is then the consequence of that?
Right.
What is the consequence of completion rates overall that should be much higher?
Right.
And when I talk to faculty, it's not about lowering rigor. This has nothing whatsoever to do with, grade inflations. There's a piece in the Chronicle recently about the inflation of grades, and that is concerning. But that's the bigger picture here is the front door kind of accessibility and an approach that would be quite strategic at each of our institutions as partners, not as competitors,
Right.
to see individuals in this country and individuals throughout the world educated.
Like, that's the goal.
Right?
That is the goal.
Based on the principle that an educated populace within a country or globally have better lives, live more likely at peace, in an environment where their kids are thriving, and setting aside all kinds of things that divide us. But what are the things we have in common?
Right.
And I think there are some pretty shared kind of goals that humans have about their life. They'd like to live in peace, have a nice home, send their kid off to, not have to worry about where they're going to get, safety. Yeah. I mean, we get to Maslow, and I think we've covered it, and then it's like, okay, and then what's next? Where do those aspirations take you next?
Absolutely. And that should be foundational, just as we talk about healthcare,
Right.
And in certain, unfortunately, healthcare and education in this country are things that you have to aspire to and have privilege, employment, right, to get. If you're not employed, you're likely not going to have the most affordable healthcare plan.
Right.
And depending upon what your employer selects depends on what your economic impact is.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
But if you're completely uninsured, then that means you're not getting preventative measures taken care of. You're not able to address acute issues that may come up your way. But then you're saddled with either things that could have been prevented in terms of disease prevention or financial ramifications that also tell you don't go to the doctor. Because the last time I went, I ended up with, right?
Yeah, this was the outcome.
And so that's
less money in my bank account,
exactly,
et cetera.
Right? And the same thing is true, unfortunately, in higher ed.
Yep.
It's higher ed. Literally.
Yep.
Meant that everybody doesn't have that.
Yeah. I love the interconnection of that and the kind of crosswalk between those two, and then thinking about what does a world look like with more people having access and more people completing. I think, which is certainly a shared goal between, it should be, right? One that we can all acknowledge between Western Governors, University of Utah, and all of our partners across higher ed.
Absolutely.
A lot of folks, last question, or next to last question.
Okay.
Next to last question would be, there's a lot of talk, rightly so, about the role that technology can play in both creating greater access as well as helping students get on track, stay on track. I'm interested in your thoughts on that. If there have to be these binaries, which I don't know that there have to be, and I imagine, knowing you well enough, that you're going to be like, oh, come on, Chase.
Right.
You're creating another false binary here, and get out of that.
Right.
Get out of that lane. Human touch.
Yes.
Chatbot.
Right.
Thinking about more and more students in a broader student population or a student base, and then where the human interaction piece fits within all of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think from an evidence-based standpoint, we know that students strive from that coaching, faculty mentor, one-on-one intervention, right? That human touch, that outreach, that personalization, that essentially, I like to say, that signals I see you and I hear you, right? And what that does to a learner in terms of their groundedness, their sense of belonging, their ability to thrive, just to have that connection. So that, without a question, absolutely necessary. And yet, there are other things that are necessary to support that student's journey and that experience. And I think that's where technology does play an important role. And so how do you have the best of both worlds, right? And so there are a couple things I'll share in terms of my reflection on this. Again, connected to allowing the individual providing this student support to thrive. There are things that can be automated that a chatbot can do. Some of that nudging, some of that scheduling, some of the, if we think about a coaching platform of that houses that information, how can can there be predictive analytics in terms of when mentors and coaches are typing their notes? Can there be suggestions around when that next meeting should be that is automatically sent to a student as a text, right? But my best illustration of this is going back to my coaching days and at Inside Track, looking at an operational coaching floor of hundreds of coaches in office at that time, different season, and seeing coaches sitting under their desk or lean back in their chair with their arms behind their head, staring at the sky. And what it meant was they were so freed up to be in the zone with that student. They weren't really worried about, and I'm not to say that they didn't take care of it, but they weren't worried about all of the technology that they needed to advance the meeting. But it freed them to be fully present, to provide active listening, to provide that genuine curiosity. A student can tell if you're listening, right? Yeah. I mean, we're doing it right now. You're nodding, you're smiling at me. I'm like, okay, Chase is here.
Yep.
Even if he's thinking about what he's getting for lunch, he's giving me the signals, right? And so when you're having a conversation with someone, those things are necessary. I think the technology supports individuals being able to do that, right? And so the human touch, for example, in the last week, 2 different people have signaled in a conversation that, let's say this was a chat bot, might have had a different response. But one shared very surface in a conversation that their relative had been diagnosed with cancer. Another one shared really quickly in a group setting that their mother-in-law had passed. As a human, you have to stop.
Yep.
Right? You don't necessarily take them down a path that's overwhelming, but the chatbot goes on because they don't recognize the significance of the human touch of what was just stated. You got to offer a condolence, a way to support. I'm so sorry. I've been there, right? Yeah. Whatever, that's what makes us human.
Yep.
And that's what you get from that one-to-one personalized intervention. And at the same time, at scale, so my point is you have to have that human touch to have those human responses. But at the same time, what makes those human responses and the time for them possible is the technology. It's the nudge, it's the text, it's the template emails that then can be adjusted or modified to add personalization.
Right.
So I think we have to work on really identifying and how to be not intimidated by that. Like, I think AI has a place.
Yeah.
And I think instead of being on the heels and being insistent that it's just, the human touch, we have to lean in and say, where can artificial intelligence augment and really elevate that personalized experience?
Yeah.
And I think there's a definite role. So WGU is really looking at decision intelligence in terms of our work, looking at interventions, looking at data, seeing when are students most responsive, when are they, and when in the semester and term. That's what the data can tell us. And then there's certain things that we can use in technology to get a message to them so that they can connect with the human touch.
Yep. Oh, I really appreciate that. I think the sense there that we'll just simply ignore it, heads in the sand kind of approach it's just not going to hold.
It's not.
I mean, it's like you're, at the beginning, I don't know, January of 1994 or something like that, and the internet has just kind of opened up in 93, and you look over your shoulder and you're like, wait a second.
Yeah.
Well, we're just going to assume that this thing will go away.
Right. Where are we now?
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I really appreciate your thinking on that. And yeah, I mean, and acknowledging at the same. So 2 things: acknowledging that some people may be made uncomfortable by it. You look back, in history. I mean, the Industrial Revolution drives a lot of nervousness among people who say, "Okay, well, where's the role of the worker in all of this?" But what I hear you saying, Malika, and I fully agree with you, it's the second point, which is that it's technology, whatever the technological innovation is, paired with the human, where the human, has the ability to be far more empathetic, to connect with, and to say, wait a second, we're going to turn, hold on that tech. Let me connect with you on the human level about what it is. What's interesting to me, and then we'll get to the last question. Yeah. What's interesting to me, and I will welcome your response to it, is the folks who are very highly concerned and would prefer heads in the sand seem to be the very same folks who too often, in and of themselves, have a hard time, for whatever reason, stopping and connecting with an empathy-based or empathy-centered kind of approach to leadership or just human interaction.
Right. Wow.
So it's from my experience, it's offloading that onto and blaming technology. And so, whoa, wait a second. You have within your power, you have within your own agency, the ability to say, wait, if I hear about a student who has somebody in their family who's been diagnosed with cancer, or has had a death in their family, or is housing insecure, and that's driving, taking the moment to be conscious that that's driving other issues.
It is. And that has nothing to do with their responsibilities for OCHEM.
Right.
And yet not addressing that means OCHEM's not possible.
Right.
And then that means they're out of that course.
And then that means...
right?
Yeah.
And there go our retention gains.
Yep.
So you can't afford to not have that empathy.
Right. And I wholly agree. And then the willingness to look upstream, right, and say, okay, what's causing the kind of downstream kind of consequences, and then pivot and look downstream as well and say, if we don't intervene, here we know here are the other things that will likely follow. Exactly. And we don't want to say, okay, this will happen, but to a reasonable kind of extent, you can say
it's reasonable.
This is going to have an impact on the courses, including OCHEM. The student's probably not going to make it to the end of fall term. Probably not going to come back for spring.
Predictable.
What's going to happen next? A deferred dream. Again, every time we talk, Malika, I walk away thinking about our work and the privilege it is to do the work in just really new and insightful ways. So I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for your mind and your leadership and the way that you have done your work and continue to do the work. And I'm so grateful that you're here in Utah now. Yeah. Last question. We ask this to all of our guests.
Sure.
We think, and higher ed is in this moment. Here's the theory behind the question, or the thinking behind it. Higher ed's in a really pivotal moment. We're in a watershed. We're in a sea change for a variety of different reasons. And we don't have time to go through all those reasons. But I think, the notion that we're in a moment that is quite different than I think things we have seen in our lifetimes and probably the last couple of generation of higher ed leaders.
Right.
So I think in that, we should be asking the kind of question that we're trying to pose here to everybody that comes on the podcast. And that is, how do we create lasting, transformative change together?
Yeah.
How do we do it? How have you done it? How have you seen it work? If you were to say, this is how we should be doing it. If you're not seeing it, or, if there are things that, like you say, that it can be exhausting, right? To be within a place that isn't willing to interrogate the idea or the practices or policies or processes. So how do we do it together?
Together. I think that is the key. We do it together. We have to be open to having conversations like this. I think we have to have strategic partnerships. I think we have to de-silo and de-label higher education institutions, right?
Yeah.
What can WGU and the University of Utah do together?
Yeah.
And are we competitors or are we collaborators in eliminating deferred dreams?
Yeah.
And so if we do that, we may have different models, right? Fully online, campus-based, right? 4-year 4-year traditional model with, first time freshmen, right? And our model is different with having learners that have usually started somewhere, not completed, and are looking to take transfer credits and come in and finish.
Yep.
But those models being different doesn't prevent us from being collaborative on what are the best practices that you're seeing. Because at the end of the day, we're working with students.
Yep.
We're working with humans with the goal of making sure that we are not deferring people's dreams. So it is leaning into vulnerability. This isn't working. We got a problem.
Mm-hmm.
What have you tried? What were your successes? How can I help? How can we offer to be problem solvers, collaborators, thought partners, intervention strategists with the same collective goal? And that means that we can't rest on maybe the labels that separate us. Yeah, are we competing for retention? Are we competing for completion goals? Or is it one big unified goal? And so I think the ability to do that and really see the power in doing it together means we have to be willing to show our vulnerabilities and our challenges, and also share our wins and our successes. This is how we did this. This is what's working for us. And together, imagine a new strategy.
Awesome. That's awesome. I mean, I love the labels piece because it's like, yeah, those labels are convenient.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole industry, we won't name them, but there's a whole industry that loves those labels, that loves to sort us and loves to rank us so that then we see ourselves as, okay, we need to get to that number one spot, or we need to be competing in this space.
Right.
All the while missing that larger commitment that we share and the values and the goals that we share.
Right. If you all win, we win.
Right.
If we win, you all win.
Right.
So let's win together.
Yeah. I love it. I absolutely love it. Malika, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
For being here, sharing your experiences, sharing your insights. All of our viewers and listeners are going to be like, that's why Chase loves to sit down with Malika. I'm really sincerely grateful for your time and your leadership.
Absolutely.
Folks, this has been Together, a higher ed podcast. We know that you're going to watch this, love it. You want to see more of these episodes or listen to more episodes, feel free to check us out wherever you download your podcasts or listen to podcasts, including on YouTube. And join us next time.